going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Into the Squared Circle podcast. And it's not a ordinary Into the Squared Circle podcast. It is Into the Squared Circle podcast Rewind. That's right, folks. We hop into the time machine, dial back the time. Let's pick up McFly and Doc and let's head back and let's go back to the past, right? Who doesn't like old school wrestling, right? No standards, no bar timeline. We can go back to the carny days, the carnival days, man versus bear. We can talk about the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the 2010s. All things pro wrestling. So welcome to the Into the Square Circle podcast Rewind. I'm your host, GBs, as I mentioned. And on this episode, we will talk about WWE Biography. We'll talk about the first 3 episodes from WWE Biography. Yes, that's right. We're going to talk about Sergeant Slaughter, Scott Hall. Also on the list, Randy Orton. Other programming we're going to talk about in the past, Dark Side of the Ring. That's right. We're going to talk about the first 3 Dark Side of the Ring, which is featured on Vice Television. We're going to talk about the Baylor of Earthquake John Tenta, Buff and the Bagwells. That was an interesting one. And talk about an interesting story. Terry Gordy, the final flight of the Freebird. So 3 and 3 from WWE Biography and A&E and the Dark Side of the Ring on Vice TV. We will discuss about both programs right here on the show. But before I continue on, follow me on my social media platforms Into the Square Circle podcast. I have the video up right now. Here we go, right up here. And we're going to be available on Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and a new platform to join you, man. And whoever thought I would join this platform? Into the Square Circle podcast is now available on TikTok. I know, man. I refuse to go on there, but I'm on her now. And there's a nice crowd on there, man. Nice crowd. Upload a couple videos as well. So join me right now on TikTok Into the Squared Circle podcast. Also available on Podcast Land, as I mentioned, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Go to your favorite podcasting platforms and type in Into the Square Circle podcast right now and take a listen and hit the follow and a like and give me a 5-star review about the show and share it to your friends. Also, patreon.com/Into the Square Circle podcast. $1.99 a month will give you all the access to not all the old archive of the episodes, but you're in control of the bonus content, meaning you choose the topic, you choose whatever you want to talk about. We can have some trivia, $1.99 a month, plus your name will be featured on the credit right here on the podcast and on YouTube. So head over to right now to patreon.com/Into the Square Circle podcast, $1.99, subscribe today. All right, without further ado, let's kick off the show. Talk about WWE Biography. So really good stuff, man. And this is my first season watching it. Now, I understand WWE Biography has been going on for quite a bit, right? And I finally caught up to it and I watched the first 3. It was good stuff. And I'll put the graphic right up here. So on YouTube, if you're watching. So if you haven't watched WWE Biography, it's featured on A&E. What's the A&E? Arts Entertainment. I don't know what the channel is called for, but it's a an offshoot channel. I don't want to say that's the word, but A&E has been producing WWE biographies. It's like a little documentary series, and my understanding, this season each superstar has 2 hours. Incredible, and well done. Well done. I enjoyed it. I fell in love with it. Good stuff, of course. And you know, so far I watched the first 3. The 4th episode, which was based off DDP, Diamond Dallas Page. I still need to watch that. So that will be on part 2 of the A&E review right here in Into the Square Circle podcast Rewind. So we will talk about that in the coming future, of course. But I forgot to mention my action figure of the week, as I promised last episode. It's a retro, right? This is a retro rewind episode. So I'll put the video up right now, right up here. And it's the AEW version of Owen Hart action figures, the Luminary action figure. Really cool. I never owned an Owen Hart action figure in my life, nor a Bret Hart or anybody in the Hart family. I'm quite surprised in my collection. I don't have a boxed or unpackaged Hart family action figures. This is my first Hart and definitely my first Owen Hart action figure under the AEW collection series. I put the video up now. It's also available on YouTube as well if you want to watch it, or on TikTok. It's up there right now. So really cool. That's my action figure pick of the week for this episode. Of course, the Owen Hart AEW collection action figure. So much action figures to show on here. So much money I have in my pocket and spend, right? All right, so let's talk about WWE Biography. Let's get back on track here. All right, first episode, Randy Orton. Have you watched it? YouTube Lamb, Podcast Land. Let me know what you guys think. Into the Square Circle Podcast, Facebook, X, Instagram, also on TikTok. Send me a DM. Randy Orton, very interesting 2-hour show of him. A lot of stuff I didn't know. There was some stuff I kind of knew. So his history, right? Some of the things I didn't know about Randy Orton. So we know he is the son of the great Hall of Famer, Cowboy Bob Orton Jr., right? Randy joined the military. I did not know that, right? He wasn't sure what his future was going to be, what he wants to do as an adult. So what he did was decided to join the Marines, right? He joined the Marines. And I guess in the recruitment center, they're like, okay, well, you're going to get some beer. You're going to meet some hot chicks. If you sign right here on the dotted line. And Randy Orton was a smart one, signed his ass up to the military, went over to, I believe, San Diego, where the Marines are based off. And he flew over there, did a little bit of training with the Marines, of course. And he that's how he shaped out to be a man, right? A tough son of a gun. And eventually he discovered another side of the military, hazing, right? Hazing for all the young guys are joining the military. And he saw what was going on in the deep halls of the Marines in San Diego. And he didn't like it, right? How they were treating back in the late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere around that time period. And he's like, screw you guys. I want out. So he went to the military and he was like, hey, I don't like what's going on. Treating these people coming in, these new soldiers coming in. I want out. In the military, the Marines were like, screw yourself, buddy. You just signed yourself to the government. You ain't going anywhere. Get your ass back in the bunker. So Orton was like, well, screw these guys. I'm going to hop on a bus and head back to St. Louis and be with my family. I don't want to be part of this. I didn't sign up for this, the hazing part. So he hopped on the bus and went back to St. Louis. And his family was like, we're pissed off that you did this. You made the decision. And well, just got to face the fact, man. Go back. So Orton went back to the Marines in San Diego. And they're like, well, since you decided to leave, we're going to punish you. So they put him in their version of the prison jail over there at the military base. He was locked up for a month or two, probably more. And eventually they signed him off. Okay, you don't want to be here? We signed you off. Get the hell out of here. So Orton left the military, was discharged. And from there, he had a little process like what he wanted to do. And eventually pro wrestling stuck to Randy Orton. And he asked his father, look, I want to commit to the business. And his father was like, okay, let me get a couple phone calls. So his father called Bruce Pritchard over there in WWE land. And he mentioned to Bruce mentioned to Vince McMahon. Vince was like, okay, well, WWE will be in St. Louis. Come on by. We'll show you around, give you a tour, meet the boys backstage. And I believe this is what, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So here is Orton and his father. And everybody wants to see his father instead of Randy. And okay, you're down for it, right? And Randy is like, yeah, sure, I'm down for it, man. So what they do, they send Randy, or actually they gave money to Randy for housing, get a little small little apartment, and went down to Louisville, Kentucky. OVW, right? Ohio Valley Wrestling, ran by Jim Cornette, right? Down there in Louisville, Kentucky. So he went down there and he was part of that class. And I was part of this story. And I'm what I mean by part of the story as a fan, right? As a fan, I was part of this journey, right? I was part of seeing these homegrown talent become big stars. And we'll explain about that shortly. So he was down there training with Batista, right? Who was known as Leviathan. He was down there training with them. John Cena, the prototype, down there in Louisville at OVW, these young guys before they were called up to the WWE main roster. So these guys got a lot of training, but Orton, he was cocky, right? He was there to make money. It's just like certain other individuals out there. I didn't came here to wrestle. I just came here to make money. He had a cocky attitude. Nobody liked him, right? He didn't want to take this seriously as a professional career. Eventually, he got called up to the WWE. He had a dark match. Orton did, and eventually Orton was very impressive. So they decided to push him on the main roster, and he got his name out there. I actually I think he got hurt. I think he got hurt in that time period. And then like, damn man, like here I am to the main roster. He got his name out there, and he gets hurt. How about that? And they had a little tactic. You know what? We're gonna remind the fans that I'm still around, despite I'm hurt. I don't want them to forget my name. So I'm going to show up and piss off the fans. So he found a way to piss them off and irritating them each and every week, telling them, hey, I'm still hurt, but I'm going to show up to remind you I'm going to come back very, very soon. And and that's where he got the reputation. Fans didn't like him from that. So eventually Randy Orton got a lot of steam, got a lot of attraction and notice from one of the great factions of the 2000s, right? Evolution. Again, childhood memories for me. Ric Flair, Batista, Triple H, Randy Orton. What a collective of a group. Evolution. My goodness, one of my favorite periods of time, man. When you have Flair in the mix, alcohol, booze, limo, jet flying, women, money. You got yourself a group right there, a faction, a star-studded faction. And the evolution period was just one of my favorite periods of pro wrestling. And what a period in 2000s. And I do have books, right? My program books. They have proof to tell you that I was there in person to witness these great storylines from the 2000s. Absolutely phenomenal. So eventually, Randy Orton was started to become huge, right? Popular. Eventually, Orton got disbanded from Evolution. You know the story, right? You know, when he was on the shoulders of Batista, Triple H did the thumbs down and they booted his ass out of there. And from there, all they did was skyrocket. They skyrocketed Randy Orton to stardom, won the title, and this is the phase where everybody didn't like about Randy Orton behind the scenes as well. And I've been hearing these stories as a fan, right? Again, I talked about this being a fan, going to the All-State Arena, been to numerous shows. I can't tell you how many shows I've been to the WWE pay-per-views, Raws, SmackDowns, house shows at the All-State Arena. I can't tell you how many shows I went to. And I will love to have an episode, my top 10 favorite shows I've seen at the legendary All-State Arena. But talking to fans outside of the arena, people will tell me, man, we saw Randy at the store at Target across the street at the Allstate. We saw him at the IHOP across the street. We came across him. He was a dick. He was a piece of shit. he was an asshole. And we hear this from the fans because they confronted him outside of the arena in the past. And it's weird, like hearing it live in the moment. I'm like, no, he's not that kind of person. Well, there we go. They featured in the WWE biography of Randy Orton, and even the wrestlers like this guy's a piece of shit. I'm like, God damn, it is true. He really was a cocky asshole as a champion. He thought he was the drizzling shits. Orton thought he was all that in a bag of chips. He had an attitude. Yeah, he was the top star, but man, he was out there. They show his videos of him, not want, like, don't touch me, like don't get near me. I don't want to talk to you. But there's a hot chick in the front row. That's it, man. He's right to it. And that was Randy Orton, man. Eventually, he was on the road just like any other wrestler who's been, grinding on the road cross country. His body was hurting, right? His body was breaking down as a wrestler, even till today. The current WWE roster, they're still going through this, man. When you're on the road 300 days in a year, busting your ass off town to town, your body's starting to break down, right? And that's where pills come in. And you hear this in every story when it came to any legend. I mean, it's going down the history. Pills, right? Vicodin, what's the other one? Just taking pills to relieve your pain when you're on the road. When you put your body through hell, it becomes a demon, addiction. And Orton went through numerous pills addiction. And that was the downside of Randy Orton, right? He had back issues. He was popping pills like it was candy daily. And eventually they put him to rehab. And they're like, you know what, dude? You're in too much stardom. You're a dick backstage. You're on pain pills. You need to go home. And he went to rehab and he light his way. Yeah, there was a story in his biography where he told the therapist or the rehab doctor, he's like, yeah, man, I kind of stopped doing it, but he was bullshitting his way through because he was still doing popping pills. And he still continued to do it afterwards when he came out of rehab. And WWE put him back in the spotlight again. And he still continued to do his antics until one day he was leaving his show. He was driving on an expressway. He popped in another pills, or he took sleeping pills or something to kind of calm him down. I believe he was heading home after his show because I think it was a show was close by to his house. And that's where he lost control. And in his life changed in an instant like that. And eventually he okay, the Hall of Fame, right? WrestleMania 21, right? Los Angeles. He inducted his father in the Hall of Fame, but he was out partying the night before. And I guess he was supposed to have a rehearsal match because he was supposed to face The Undertaker at WrestleMania. Well, Randy Orton never showed up at WrestleMania or at the rehearsal to train or at least go over the match with The Undertaker. Undertaker was pretty pissed. Vince McMahon, a lot of people were pissed off because he didn't show up for the rehearsals of WrestleMania with The Undertaker for the run through. So because he was out partying and he overslept. Yet better, he was supposed to induct his father at the Hall of Fame the night before. And he didn't get his father the proper send off. He gave him like probably the shortest speech of WWE Hall of Fame history. He gave his father a 60-second speech. And he was sitting on stage while his father was doing his own speech. He was slouching, he was falling asleep, and you can hear the cameraman like, hey man, you need to sit straight. You're live on television. Your father is being inducted on stage, and this is how you disrespect him. And Orton wrestled WrestleMania, and he knew he did a crappy job, and he knew he got his ass chewed out. And from there on, his life changed. He met his lovely wife, and well, what's the odds of that? He meet his lovely wife because she was a fan at a house show, and apparently she was sitting out in the different seats out in the concourse or out in the arena. And when Orton was leaving, his wife moved his way up, or future wife moved her way up to the front row and caught Randy Orton's attention. and that's how they dated, and that's how they got married. So what's a small world of that happening? Orton meets a female fan who rushed on her way up to the front row and caught his attention, and here they are married with kids. And that was the rest of the story, man. He had kids, and his cocky attitude, his badassness was gone, right? He started to become a parent, responsibility. His attitude was changing behind the scenes, and people were noticing it. And now he's a father, right? He's a father. Randy Orton made up his time with his father, who was on the road throughout the 80s and 90s, right? Wasn't there for Randy. Now they're having their father and son moment playing catch, and they're playing catch with Randy Orton, his kids, his father playing with his grandkids. So it was a nice, great story. Obviously, Randy's going through some back issues. They talked about that at the very end. Of course, Mr. Bro himself, what's his name? The former WWE superstar who was in MLW, bro. Shit, what's his? Uh, I'm drawing a blank, but you know what his name is. His former tag team partner got fired because of failing drug policy. Matt Riddle, right? Matt Riddle was featured on there, and had a close relationship with him, like a brother. But then he got fired due to a drug wellness policy fail. But is what it is. But overall, this was a great Randy Orton biography. And let me know what you guys think about it right here on YouTube and on Podcast Land. All right, so episode number 2, Sergeant Slaughter. There's nothing bad about this because it was a great American story. Sergeant Slaughter, known as Bob Reed, kicked off becoming a professional wrestler. He was a big, tall, quiet guy in high school. Eventually, he transitioned to a pro wrestler. He wanted to do that. And he was known as Bob Reed, or Sergeant Bob Slaughter. I guess he went through numerous gimmicks, and nothing was sticking. So Bob Reed was watching an army television show, and he's like, maybe I should become a sergeant. And he went to a local military store, bought himself a sergeant hat, some camouflage shirts, and he was known as Sergeant Bob Slaughter. And he wrestled at the AWA territories, and um, the gimmick sticked. And he felt like a real drill sergeant, like, you maggots. It was great. It was great. And he met a lovely female. He got married with her, had kids, but she was not a fan of wrestling. She was not a fan of him being on the road. Eventually, he was picked up by the WWF, if I'm not mistaken, Vince Sr., and that's where he picked him up. And I believe he had a match with, man, I'm trying to remember. Was it Pat Patterson at Madison Square Garden? Was it that story? Yeah, I believe that was that story. And eventually he went away, and Sarge went to the territories again, the AWA, and was building up steam, right? He was picking up his name. And eventually he was getting recognized throughout the territories. And eventually Vince Sr., who bought out the WWF, or bought up the WWF and shortened it to the World Wrestling Federation. And they called them up like, hey, man, we need you back up here. We can use you. And they brought him out to the WWF, and his story exploded, right? The LJN figures. He became a superhero, right? The fans, he was a well-known. I believe he had a feud with the Iron Sheik, not the original one, but the Iron Sheik Baba. And during the late 80s, mid to late 80s, and that was way before he turned heel with Hulk Hogan, which we'll get to shortly. But yeah, man, he got huge. He was patriotic. He was a superstar. He was traveling cross country, but that's where his wife didn't see him. His kids didn't see him very much. He was always on the road, but he was larger than life. He had LGN figures. He was the G.I. Joe character action figure. He was part of the cartoon. He was huge. He was to the top. Sergeant Slaughter was well known to the world, right? He became a massive superstar. Eventually, like any other gimmick, his gimmick was starting to slow down. His popularity was starting to go down, and his GI Joe contract was cutting off. And Vince was like, "Hey, man, your action figure money, yeah, it's cutting off, man, and we don't have very much for you at this very moment." So Sarge decided to go back on the territories again, NWA, AWA, and joined the territories again and get his name out there. Became a babyface, but again, his schedule was a lot less compared to the WWF, meaning he was home with his family more, with his home with his wife more. So that was a positive for Sergeant Slaughter. Eventually, he got the phone call. He's like, from Vince McMahon, of course, like, "Hey, man, we can use you, and we want to turn you into a heel." And they're like, "Ooh, man." Even his wife was like, "I don't think that's a good idea." And this was in the time where the United States was at war, I believe, in Afghanistan or Kuwait with Saddam Hussein. And man, it just a crazy time of the early 90s, right during the war, the original George Bush era of the war. And this was the real deal, right? It was a scary moment for the United States. And they want Sergeant Slaughter to join the Iron Sheik, who's part of Iran. And his wife's like, "Oh, don't do it. You're gonna screw up not only your career, but you're gonna screw up our kids' lives as well." And Sarge was like, "Well, we can make Hulk Hogan a huge baby face representing the United States of America, and Sergeant Slaughter represent the bad guys, right? Joining the Iron Sheiks and the Iran." And they went for it, and their goal was to sell out what the LA Coliseum for WrestleMania. And because of the security threat, they moved it into the LA Sports Arena. And so trying to get many fans as possible, but they still sold out the LA Sports Arena. And long story short, they had this amazing feud, Sergeant Slaughter and Hulk Hogan, right? People hated Sarge's guts because he was representing the country that's at war with America. And again, death threats, right? They were getting death threats to Sarge and his family. His kids were going through pain in school. So they had hired security guards to oversee Sergeant Slaughter's house. And his wife was not happy about everything. She knew what was coming. Long story short, the feud ended at WrestleMania. Hogan defeated Sergeant Slaughter. And again, Penn Niman, get the great American story, right? Hulk Hogan defeated Sergeant Slaughter at WrestleMania. The USA won. And that story ended, right? And eventually Sergeant Slaughter transitioned to a backstage role. You remember he was the commissioner during the Attitude Era, and he was part of that era. Eventually, he started working independent scenes afterwards, and his career kind of slowed down. And now he's making a convention appearance, and now he's part of the Hall of Fame now. And great story, Sergeant Slaughter. Eventually, he had a divorce. That's the only sad part with his wife because she was not happy of him not being around. He was never around. He was always part of the wrestling industry. Again, from being a wrestler to being a backstage commissioner, an agent, he was never home. So his wife divorced him. He was heartbroken about that, but she was again from the start never agreed with him joining the wrestling industry. But is what it is. But they're still friends today, and I believe they got remarried. And now he spends a lot of time with his family. He's home now, retired. He does go to conventions once or twice a week, but he's home every day to spend time with his family. That's a great ending to his story. Nothing sad, nothing depressing. This was a great American Sergeant Slaughter story. And of course, there was I think it was a Jim Norton interview where Sergeant Slaughter did an interview. But again, just like an old school gimmick wrestler who will protect his gimmick, they ask him, "Did you serve the military?" Sergeant Slaughter said, "Yes, I was part of the Vietnam." And Sergeant Slaughter admitted in the past, "Look, dude, I was never part of the military." And that kind of pissed off a lot of people. I'm like, why would you fake yourself, like act like you were part of the military? And yes, he went out there, he thanked all the servicemen, but he was part of the Americana culture. And I get that part. I get that. But also he stuck with his gimmick. Yeah, Bob Reed was never in the military, but he did stuck to his true gimmick, and he was part of the Americana culture. And it just fits with the story, right? So but yeah, man, what a great biography. 2 hours of Sergeant Slaughter. Go check it out. So Randy Orton, Sergeant Slaughter, absolutely great story. So up next, we'll talk about Scott Hall. Let's talk about that right now. So let's talk about Scott Hall. All right. So this is the third one out of the three WWE biography review, of course. And man, what a story of Scott Hall. Man, it was emotional. And I knew it was going to be emotional. I mean, just knowing his story from the outside as a fan, seeing some crazy stuff until his passing. Rest in peace, Scott Hall. But they showed his early career, right? He was a massive bodybuilder. He looked great. Eventually, here's the key part of the biography, which, man, it kind of haunted him for the rest of his life and put him into addictions. So Scott Hall was a bouncer for a strip club in Florida, right? He was fit for a bouncer. Long story short, Scott Hall did a no, right? I guess you're not supposed to date a stripper when you're working in the stripping community. I'm not sure how you call it. And the bouncer decided to fall in love with the stripper. Well, eventually the stripper had a mix up with another individual. Eventually, Scott Hall and this individual had a scuffle, and they took it back outside of the strip club. And I guess this individual pulled a gun, and he was ready to, according to Scott Hall, that's what he said. He that this guy was ready to pull the gun on Scott Hall, and Scott reversed it, and he pulled it on him, shot him, and killed him. I did not know about this story. By the way, the interview of Scott Hall in this interview was an exclusive, never seen before one-on-one interview with Scott Hall. So only the WWE has his footage. This was back in 2014, I'm not mistaken. And it was a very emotional. And eventually actually Scott Hall took the camera film crew and took him to the exact strip club, which is still standing, I guess, the exact spot where he shot and killed this individual over this stripper. And long story short, I guess the stripper, he was in love. Eventually, they broke up after all this. Now, keep this in mind that this story he talked about killing that he never talked about in the public played a key role throughout his adult years. So eventually, uh, he got picked up by, I believe, Diamond Dallas Page. I can't remember through my mind. And he got himself into pro wrestling, right? And I think he got into the territories, Scott Hall. And eventually he was what? He got picked up by WCW. He was what? The Diamond Stud. And Kevin Nash, who was another gimmick, the Grand Wizard, right? He was the Grand Wizard. And Scott Hall was the Diamond Stud. And these guys were a tag team, and they were a great tag team. And that's how Kevin Nash and Scott Hall became friends through that period. But eventually, he went back to the territories, or he got picked up by the WWF. And Scott Hall went to the WWF, and he was known as Razor Ramon. And now again, Scott Hall came from Florida. Scott Hall came up with a gimmick where he had was like Tony from Scarface, right? Hey, say hello to my little friend. And that's where Scott Hall got the idea and became that Cuban badass in pro wrestling. And that's where the Razor Ramon came from. And he became a star. He became an absolute star. But the pinnacle moment of his wrestling career when he won the Intercontinental Champion. Obviously, we cannot skip the issue where he had that phenomenal ladder match that put ladder matches probably in the top 5 in history of pro wrestling. And WrestleMania, was it WrestleMania 10? WrestleMania 10, Scott Hall versus Shawn Michaels in the ladder match for the Intercontinental Champion. One of the all-time classics, right? We could talk about it forever. And there's an action figure based off that moment. I gotta try to get my hands on it. Man, what a history moment for the Intercontinental Champion, right? Scott Hall versus Shawn Michaels, right? Just history. Eventually, Scott Hall, I'm sorry, Kevin Nash joined the WWF, and he was known, right? Diesel, right? Diesel. And long story short, Scott Hall or Razor Ramon's character was slowing down. And eventually all the partying started to begin and the booze came in. I think around the time frame where probably the WCW NWO days. But I know booze got into it. But eventually the Razor Ramon era was slowing down. And eventually his contract was about to come up and he had his final match, I believe, at the Madison Square Garden at a house show. Obviously, if you're a true wrestling fan, right, you know the history, the curtain call, which was talked about in the past. I can't remember which programming, Dark Side of the Ring, but the curtain call, right, where Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, they all came out. They hugged Scott Hall at the very end and they were not happy, and that's where they punished Triple H because of the curtain call. And they were obviously they pushed Stone Cold to the moon for the world title spot. So see the trickle effect, right? That's where Scott Hall left the WWF and joined WCW, the rival promotions. They picked up Kevin Nash down the road, the Outsiders, and then that's where the NWO was born with Hulk Hogan, and they were larger than life, right? Larger than life. And from there, his career skyrocketed. Eventually, that's where Scott Hall got abused by substance, right? Alcohol, drugs. Um, Eventually, he was getting pretty bad, showing up, arriving drunk. And that's where Eric Bischoff sent him to rehab. But again, that didn't help, right? That didn't help. And obviously, Scott Hall went through numerous marriages, one or two, three marriages. I think he had kids as well. Never home. Again, never home. Always on the road for the WWF at the time. Eventually, when he was part of the NWO, WCW, and WCW contract, he had more money but less dates. So he was home a little bit more during the WCW days, but he was going through issues. Again, going back to the story where Scott Hall killed that individual outside of the strip club. It was messing up here mentally because he knew he killed somebody. And that was messing up. And I think the alcohol was going through his body, drinking, drinking, drinking. Throughout the story, he wants to drink himself. He take pop pills and he wanted to do that stuff to kill his own self because he knew he killed the other guy. And Scott Hall knew he wanted to die. He didn't deserve to be on this earth. He was going through a lot of demons up here. And that was the beginning of his demons, right? Eventually, Scott Hall came out of rehab, but they tried his best and he was still fighting it. Eventually, was the WCW went out of business, right? We know the story of that. WWE bought it. Scott Hall Did a little bit independent scenes. Again, gone through a lot of stuff. Eventually, he got cleaned up for somewhat. Went to rehab again, and they revived the NWO and the WWE, right? And they brought him back, and still going through it, man. Still going through his addictions, the demons, right? And obviously, throughout the story, he told the story about the strip club. He killed somebody with Hulk and Eric Bischoff, and he finally opened up about it, right? He kept all this stuff inside of him. He told nobody, and eventually, his run in the WWE came up, and his addiction got worse. He went missing. He was drinking hard, and eventually he joined. I know he went to TNA wrestling, which they didn't put too much about it in the biography, which I was surprised. But yeah, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and those guys went to TNA wrestling, which they didn't show nothing. And eventually things went south really fast, and he was making independent appearances, just showing up in the early 2010s. And I remember this stories coming out where Scott Hall was supposed to make an appearance, and he showed up drunk, and he showed up stumbling down the ramp, and it was very sad. He was out of it, and it was hard to watch, right? It was hard to watch, and from there on, something needed to change. And that's where Diamond Dallas Page, right? DDP. He started up the DDP yoga, and that guy deserved an award. I'm being serious. DDP deserve a award. He helps out so many wrestlers that change their life. What, Jake the Snake Roberts, so many other guys. Scott Hall was another guy. And they called him up and are like, Scott, we know you want to end your life, but you can't. We need you here. And they finally convinced them to come to DDP's house down in Georgia, and they tried to clean him up much as he can. And they stayed with Jake the Snake Roberts at Diamond Dallas Page's house. They did DDP yoga. It was great, right? Hoping they would turn his life around. Eventually, the pandemic came, and for a lot of people, the pandemic was the dark side for a lot of people around the world, right? Locked up in the house. And when you're Scott Hall and you're by yourself, locked up with the demons, locked up with alcohol, drugs, not picking up your phone, it gets a lot of people worried. Long story short, was that what, 2020 or 2021? They got the police call that Scott Hall was on the floor and he was going through some issues. So they took him to the hospital. Long story short, Scott Hall passed away. Rest in peace. And I can remember what was the issue was heart related because of everything, but eventually his body quit and he left. It was what an emotional. I mean, just Diamond Dallas Page, Kevin Nash, and just watching the reaction, man. Even to me, man, I was trying not to be teary eyed watching this, but what a sad story. But it was a great world piece, Scott Hall history, and a lot of great moments, man. A lot of great moments on it. And rest in peace, man. We miss Scott Hall. We miss him. And I highly recommend checking out the biography of Scott Hall. So there we go, folks. Randy Orton, Sergeant Slaughter, and Scott Hall biography on A&E. So go check it out right now. And DDP, we'll talk about the kickoff part number 2 of the A&E biography of WWE Biography. All right. All right, good deal. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll talk about Dark Side of the Ring. I believe this is what, season 5, Dark Side of the Ring. Good stuff, man. We'll kick off talking about Earthquake John Tenta after this quick commercial break right here and Into the Square Circle podcast. Rewind. All right, welcome back, and let's talk about Dark Side of the Ring, which you can watch on Vice TV, season number 5, if I'm not mistaken. So let's talk about the first three. So let's talk about the first one, the Valor of Earthquake, John Tenta. Um, so it was the interesting story. First episode, John Tenta, big guy. Uh, I didn't know. He started off as a sumo wrestler in Japan, right? Became a huge sumo wrestler, and eventually the WWF, Vince McMahon, picked him up. I'm like, hey man, we can use you over here. Obviously, his debut television was a John Tenta was a fan. He was like a plant in the crowd, and I can't remember. It was the Ultimate Warrior. It was somebody I can't remember, but they're like, man, we need a challenger to take me down or whatever. And I'm like, who in the crowd will come down here and take me down? And like, how about that guy? And people were pointing at him and like, okay, come on, man, get in the ring. What's your name? John Tenta. All right. And they took him down. And that's where Earthquake was born. And he became a massive powerhouse as a wrestler. Eventually, they put him up against his former partner, Typhoon, right? Typhoon. And they became a tag team known as the Natural Disasters. And they became a destructive tag team, right? Against the Nasty Boys, a lot of great tag teams, right? And eventually that tag team fell apart, and the Earthquake gimmick was slowing down. Eventually, Earthquake went to Japan and wrestled over there. Typhoon. A lot of this episode, at least in the middle of it, went to the Shockmaster, where Typhoon, his career was slowing down the WWE, and he went to WCW, and he was known as the Shockmaster, right? The iconic Shockmaster, where he was wearing a, I don't know, a stormtrooper glittered helmet, and then he went through a wall, and the helmet came off, and it was the most embarrassing moment. And obviously, Sting, the Surfer Sting, was on set, and this is probably the worst embarrassing moment in pro wrestling history. But they were doing a lot of the Typhoon character Shockmaster segment. But eventually, John Tenta went to Japan as a wrestler, and he got huge as a wrestler. Obviously, the famous wrestling match was oh man, I can't remember a well-known wrestler in Japan, and it became a great match. And he decided to break character and told the Japan fan, "This guy's a fake wrestler." He came back. He was known as the Earthquake of the WWF. He can't fight, and John Tenta was like, "Okay, dude, you want to call me out in front of everybody and tell me I'm a fake? Come at me, bro." And John Tenta was ready to strike him, and that Japanese wrestler jumped out there and ran the hell out of there because they knew that he struck fear from John Tenta. You know, he was a legit man. He was a former sumo, so he was big in Japan. And eventually he came back to the America, but I think he signed with WCW. I mean, he went through numerous gimmicks, but he was like a shark guy, and eventually, he went back to the WWF during the Attitude Era, and he was part of the Odyssey, right? The Odyssey, that wacky faction group from the '90s Attitude Era, under a mask. So they didn't bring him back as Earthquake. They just brought him back as was it Gogol, the guy with the mask, wearing walking around the South Park, like a stuffed doll with Krugen and the Odyssey Luna. Eventually, his career just went down, man. He stopped wrestling. John Tenta stopped wrestling. And that's where the sad part came in. He got a job as a retail manager, and then eventually became a truck driver because he needed to make more money. Long story short, he came across a health problem as a truck driver. And I don't know if he had like a heart issue or a blood issue or something, but eventually, he went to the hospital. They're like, "Yeah, man, you're going through some stuff right now." And he eventually stayed home to spend time with his family. But long story short, John Tenta passed away. Yeah, gone through some health issues that yeah, man, got a very sad story at the very end. And it's great that they highlight one of the great earthquakes. And that was the first episode of Dark Side of the Ring. And what do you guys thought about this first episode of John Tenta? That was great. They highlight Earthquake and then feature the Shock Master a little bit in the story. So that was episode number 1 of John Tenta, formerly known as Earthquake in the WWF. All right, let's talk about episode number 2. Buff and the Bagwells. And that was an interesting, entertaining episode. So, Marcus Bagwell and the Bagwell family. I had a lot of stuff I didn't know about this, right? The Bagwell family. They were really rich people from down south, right? Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, whatever state they were from. I think Georgia. And they were a wealthy family, right? They owned some kind of lumber yard or some kind of family business, and the Bagwells were really rich. They had like over 200 or 200 employees they own, and Marcus Bagwell was spoiled, and his father bought him like a Corvette or like a fancy sports car, and everybody had a gun in their house, and Marcus Bagwell was spoiled because there was a rich Southern family, and there was a funny story where um his father was getting really anger with Marcus Bagwell's mother, and she felt like she was being threatened by the father, and she's like, "Marcus, go inside and grab the gun." So Marcus went inside and grabbed a pistol, and Marcus knew his father had a gun top of the fridge. So his father is like, "Okay, son, you want to point a gun at me? I'll be right back." He goes inside and grabs a gun, and he's like, "You want to shoot me? Go ahead and shoot me, man." And yeah, come on, man, I'm your father. And Marcus decided to shoot his father right here in the shoulder. Obviously, his father is still alive to tell his side of the story. But yeah, man, Marcus was man enough to shoot his father. He's like, "You want to hurt my mother? Fine, then I'll hurt you." There was another one where Marcus Bagwell's father, he was playing poker. He lost a game of poker, got pissed off, grabbed the gun, and went outside and shot a bunch of birds. That was hilarious. So Marcus Bagwell was like, you know what, man? I need to do something. I need to do something. And eventually, Missy Hyatt, right? First female, what she was known as the first female backstage or correspondent in WCW. And she saw Marcus Bagwell and she's like, "Hey, you should become a pro wrestler." And I think they were living in the same apartment complex. And she's like, "Man, you should be a wrestler. Want to become one?" And he's like, "Sure." And that's where he went and joined the power plant and started training. Was it the power plant? I know he went training. He went training and became a wrestler, and became a young stud. And eventually he joined WCW in the early days and got well known and became a well known superstar. And I think he became a tag team partner as the male models, the Maximum male models. He became a tag team partner with was it Scotty Riggs? It was Scotty Riggs, and became huge tag team wrestlers, but they were like hotties, right? Wearing tuxedo, was shirtless with no arms on them, and bringing what was that, the Sportatorium in Texas? One of the two, but they were well known, right? Marcus Bagwell was becoming well known wrestler because of his good looks and his physiques, attracting the females in the front rows. Eventually, the tag team split up. They were like, you know what? We're gonna put you in the NWO. And he's like, "Okay, sure." And eventually Marcus Bagwell became Buff Bagwell, and he joined the NWO, and that's where the NWO was the height, right? The Attitude Era, and he was making money. He was getting popular. He was getting famous. There was a spot where he wanted to put implants on his calves because he knew his calves on his legs were skinny. So he went and got implants in his calves and his legs, and eventually he had medical reaction from it, And they did surgery to get him out. And he's like, come on, man, keep the calves in. I want to make my legs look good. And they're like, no, man, you're going through some medical issues. We're taking them out. Eventually, the Bagwell family, lost a lot of money and their business went bankrupt. So Buff Bagwell was making a lot of money through the NWO. And eventually, he made enough money to hire his family. And he was paying his mom, his dad, and, do chores around the house while Buff Bagwell was touring around the world. And, man, Slick Johnson, the referee from TNA, I didn't know he was close friends with Marcus Bagwell. And I got to say, he was the highlight of the episode. Absolutely funny. There was a spot where Slick Johnson was walking into the house and he was looking for Marcus and he looked in the bathroom and his mom was shaving Buff Bagwell's balls in the bathroom. I ain't shitting you, man. This was what Slick Johnson said. They had a reenactment of Buff Bagwell bent over and his mother shaving his balls in the bathroom. Oh my God. I'm like, this seriously did happen? Marcus was paying his family members. He was making enough money during the NWO days. And eventually, Buff Bagwell had a serious incident where he faced Scott Steiner. No, not Scott Steiner, Rick Steiner. Rick Steiner in the match. And I guess Rick Steiner did a suplex on Buff Bagwell. And the way he took that suplex, his neck took a nasty bump. And it was very serious. And they stopped the match, or finished the match. Long story short, people thought he was paralyzed because his body shut down after taking a nasty suplex. Eventually, his spine had a bruised spine, right? And he couldn't wrestle. Um, and yeah, man, he couldn't wrestle. He couldn't wrestle for a couple months. So, but he still showed up. He still showed up on television in a wheelchair to remind the fans he was still around. And eventually, he made a comeback and wrestled. And that's right around the time where WCW was bought out by the WWE. And there were a handful of wrestlers from WCW was going to WWE, and there was a handful that just never did. The Vince never hired. And eventually they're like, okay, Buff, we can hire you. We can hire you. So what they did is Buff Bagwell did a tryout with Shane Helms, right? The Hurricane, Shane the Hurricane Helms. Apparently, according to Buff, he had the incident at the tryout where I guess Shane Helms again came from the WCW, and he made a smart ass comment to Buff Bagwell, and he was like, "Hey, dude, yeah, you finally showed up, man. You're gonna show up on time. You're gonna lay off the pills and blah blah blah," and became a smart ass. And Buff Bagwell was like, "Look, dude, you got a problem with me? You got a problem with me." And long story short, Buff Bagwell was the first one to touch him by slapping him or punching him. Eventually, according to Buff's story, Shane Helms hit Buff Bagwell in the back of the head with the ice, like a water bottle filled with frozen ice. And eventually, Vince McMahon and the cronies caught up on the story of what happened in this incident. So Buff Bagwell had a one-on-one match against Booker T on Monday Night Raw. And he thought it was an okay match. Everybody backstage knew it was a sloppy match. And they were like, oh, it's okay, man. We can improve it next time. And the following week, they fired Buff Bagwell. So Buff Bagwell was out of the job. So what can he do? He needed the money. So he decided to do a gigolo show, which I kind of knew about, which was like a male escort channel, which was on what, HBO, where he was, getting paid by rich women and he was banging them. And eventually I think it's what, second wife, ex-wife, saw this and she was like, she's really banging these chicks for money. He was a gigolo. And he was thought he was actually banging them. The producer's like, no, dude, you don't have to really bang them. We're just gonna put censor on it and just pretend you're dry humping her. And Eventually, long story short, he became an escort, right? An escort service. And Buff Bagwell started becoming a escort, becoming, you know, rich women were paying him to date him for a week. And eventually his second wife or third wife divorced him. So eventually he went through a downward spiral and he was going through addictions. I think it was alcohol or substance abuse, pills or something. And he was going through hard times again. And I can't remember if DDP was part of this story or not, but he was going through hard times. Yeah, I think he was going through some addictions, and that's where they called up was it Ron Garvin? Or no, Scotty Riggs. Scotty Riggs, his former tag team partner from WCW, and he was homeless. And they called him up as well. And I think Scotty Riggs was ready to end his life, and they're like, "No, man, we need you here with Buff, and let's straighten both of you up." And eventually, the episode ended where Buff Bagwell was like a redemption, right? Going through a straight, narrow path, and he's happy now and trying to straighten out his life. So great ending of the Buff Bagwell Dark Side of the Ring episode number 2. All right, so let's talk about episode number 3 of Dark Side of the Ring, and this is Terry Gordy, legend, legend, right? Part of the Freebirds, and what a story! I was looking forward to this episode. Great story of Terry Gordy, who started off very young in the industry, 16, 17, 18 years old, very young, tall kid. Again, he had a lot of potential. Um, he became a very popular superstar in the ring. Eventually, he joined forces with the Freebirds with Michael Hayes and just that collective of group. And eventually, they started up a well-known faction obviously the South, and obviously Freebird from Leonard Skinner it became the legendary entrance of the Freebird faction, of course. And obviously Jim Cornette was featured in his episode. And I guess this was a well-known early days of wrestlers using entrance music. And I guess the Freebirds was just the pioneers of entrance music when it came to back in the 80s, right? So the Freebirds were picking up steam. They became nasty heels and just the iconic feuds against the Von Erichs. And I remember seeing this when they had that Von Erichs episode a couple seasons ago with Dark Side of the Ring, and just man, just watching these old school videos down in World Class Championship Wrestling down in Texas at the Sportatorium. Old school, man. I love this feud. The Freebirds, man, they're getting their ass chewed out because they were like the Southern Dixie, wrestlers. Eventually, um, the Freebirds split up, and I think Terry Gordy went to Japan, made his name of himself, and obviously he was going through some issues as well. Um, I can't remember if it was just a lot of partying, right? A lot of partying during the 80s when he was with the Freebirds, a lot of drinking, just going through some crazy stuff, man. He was a party animal, and that party animal stuck with him. And throughout his year, his mental health and his physical condition was declining, right? He was going through some lot of stuff, man, a lot of physique issues, and he went to Japan and he was traveling, he was grinding, he was putting his body was going hard, man. He was going hard style. When he went to Japan, he went hard. Eventually his body shut down and he couldn't move. And, man, and eventually he was going through bad medical issues, health issues in Japan. So his family, you know, here in the United States, and they get a phone call like, yeah, man, he's in the hospital. He cannot move. And he's in Japan and he can't wrestle. And hearing that story, and eventually his nephew Terry Gordy's nephew was tag teaming up with him. And eventually he was going through declining health, right? And eventually he came back to the United States. He was doing some independent shows. He joined the Smoky Mountain Wrestling with Jim Cornette. And, he was trying to revive his character. And then I didn't know Terry Gordy's son was the character with Festus in the 2000s. Luke Gallows, who was Festus. I didn't know Terry Gordy's son was the character with Festus. I didn't know that was him. I forgot about that. And obviously Terry Gordy's daughter, who's wrestling right now in the independent scene. That was pretty cool. But Terry Gordy, man, he was joining the Smoky Mountain Wrestling. They knew he was going through declining health. And I believe Terry Gordy was, they brought him back to the WWF during the 90s. He was known as the Executioner. And they put a mask on and he had like an axe. And I guess he was like the rival of The Undertaker and Mick Foley. And I didn't know that he was the Executioner with the mask on, and eventually that went away. But they knew they had to put the mask on the protect Terry Gordy, right, to respect him, and because we knew Michael Hayes was working backstage, and he still worked with Michael. Michael Hayes still works backstage with the WWE today as well. So, but yeah, man, they wanted him. They wanted to help him and they put a mask on and eventually he went back to the independent scenes and he was still going through issues and in the early 2000s he passed away and very sad story, man, but it was a great to see all these old school 80 territories videos and him and the Freebirds, and I was excited to see this episode, man, and I became a bigger fan of Terry Gordy, and great to see his family still here to celebrate his legacy. They actually spent time with him at his later days before he passed away. But great episode if you're a fan of old school wrestling. Terry Gordy, rest in peace. All right, there you go, folks. Dark Side of the Ring, 3 episodes. 3 episodes from A&E WWE Biography. Good stuff. If you're a fan of old school wrestling, you love documentaries, you love going back in history, great stuff. Go check it out. So this was part 1 of A&E and Dark Side of the Ring, Into the Square Circle podcast rewind. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Go check it out and stay tuned to part 2. We'll talk about, there's a lot more episodes between both programming. I cannot wait. Good stuff all around. So stay tuned for that. And talk to you guys next episode right here Into the Square Circle podcast rewind.